They say Oxford is always dying or always being born, depending on your vantage point. That autumn, it seemed merely to be rusting quietly at the edges, like the gilt of an old book's spine, beginning to wear smooth from too many hands. The light came in slanted and cold, and the colleges seemed to draw in on themselves, as if bracing for something they hadn't yet imagined. Or perhaps they had, and simply chosen not to speak of it. St. Oswald's had never been my favorite. Too self-regarding, too fond of its own silences. Even its quadrangles gave the impression of listening in. But I remember, quite clearly, passing beneath its arched entrance one morning with no particular intention, and smelling the tail end of someone's pipe tobacco, lingering like the ghost of an opinion left unvoiced. Julian Norville, perhaps. He was the last to smoke a pipe in earnest. I didn't know then that he was already dead. Or rather, I didn't yet know that he was the sort of man whose death would require remembering. There are plenty of Oxford men whose final breath is taken in a panelled room no one really enters anymore, and no one thinks to ask why. But Norville had scribbled something, not quite a message, not quite a confession, in the margin of a library copy of The Elegies of Propertius. And it was that ink, not the man, that eventually raised its voice. I've always suspected that certain deaths make a sound even when they occur in silence. There had been some fragment of half-memory, flickering at the edge of things that term, but I had not reached for it. Not then. The porter, old Dunning, said it without malice. "The professor won't be needing his sherry this evening, Inspector." I thought it was a joke. The kind of dry institutional joke that serves as commentary and condolence in one breath. But there was a pause, a little too long, and then he added, "He passed in his sleep, so they say. Slipped away like a book falling shut." I stood for a while in Norville's rooms that afternoon. The curtains were open, the windows latched. Nothing smelled of death. Only the faint scent of chalk and dust and the stale dignity of old paper. The desk had been cleared mostly, save for a sheaf of ungraded essays and a small ceramic dish filled with dull-colored paper clips. A life reduced to paper clips, I remember thinking, and then immediately felt ashamed for the thought's cruelty. What struck me wasn't what was there, but what wasn't. No photographs, no family, not even the obligatory dusty decanter of port. Just books, shelves of them. Books with broken spines, annotations, slips of paper used as bookmarks that had long since lost their place. I pulled one out without meaning to. Catullus, Translation and Commentary. Page 48, a footnote underlined in blue. Forgive what cannot be repaid, only reread. There was no indication yet that Norville hadn't died of the usual academic causes. Loneliness, weariness, the gradual erosion of curiosity. But I remember running my thumb across the margin of that page and noticing the ink wasn't blue at all. It had only seemed so in the light. It was black, fading. Outside, the chapel bell rang once. Not for him, not yet. But for evensong, I think. Or perhaps for some minor commemoration. Oxford has always had a bell for every kind of ending. I left without taking anything, save the faint suspicion that something had been misfiled. A life, perhaps, or a regret too long shelved. And a phrase lodged itself somewhere in the folds of my thinking. Find the misquoted Catullus. Not that I'd read it then, that would come later. Much later, when the wind was colder and the leaves had already begun to rot underfoot. And so it began, not with a body in a library, but with a silence in a room full of books. A silence that had, perhaps, been waiting for someone to listen. It was strange, of all people, who set the whole thing moving, though I doubt he meant to. He called late in the afternoon, his voice slightly too cheerful, which always meant he was uncomfortable. A librarian from St. Oswald's had written to the coroner, apparently. Something about a marginal note in a rare text. Not an accusation, just a curiosity. He said it with the sort of offhand disdain he reserved for books, libraries, and anything else that didn't involve traffic reports or filing cabinets. Still, he thought I might want to glance at it, just in case. I told Lewis to meet me there. He said he'd be late. Some family thing, his voice apologetic, the way it always was when he tried to say no without really saying it. I didn't mind. Some places are best entered alone. St. Oswald's looked much the same as ever, as though it had been carved from the very idea of aloofness. The porter on duty was younger than I remembered, and offered no small talk, which I counted in his favor. The librarian, a thin woman with fingers that moved like birds startled from a tree, handed me the volume without comment. Elegiae et Fragmenta, 1873. Gold-leafed spine, frayed at the top, and marked in a hand I recognized before I confirmed it. Norville's, there in the bottom margin of page 91, below a line from Propertius. Nunc ego non oculis, sed cord videbo puellum. Now I shall see the girl not with my eyes, but with my heart. He had written, "Find the misquoted Catullus." It wasn't an instruction. It was too sad for that. Nor was it a puzzle in the traditional sense. It read more like an echo of something once heard clearly, now half forgotten and distant. Yet something in it resisted dismissal. The quote he'd underlined had nothing to do with Catullus, which made the note feel like an intentional misplacement. Or perhaps a warning. A misquote about misquoting, which is either clever or desperate, or both. I stood there far too long. The librarian said nothing, bless her. I asked if anyone else had checked out the book recently. She shook her head. Norville had borrowed it a month before his death. No one since. I thanked her, then lingered in the reading room. Outside, the quadrangle was beginning to lose the light. A student rushed by in an anorak far too blue for the setting, the sort of blue that reminds one the world continues whether you want it to or not. Something about the whole thing, the silence of the college, the margin note, the deliberate literary error, scraped lightly at a corner of my mind. I tried to dismiss it as a scholarly indulgence, but something refused to stay quiet. On my way out, I paused at the register, an idle glance, just to see. Norville's name, last entry, dated 3 weeks prior. The same day I noticed as a single-line entry above it. Visitor H. Eldon. A name not seen in Oxford circles since a quiet resignation in the early 80s, after a scandal too dull for headlines but too shameful for footnotes. Coincidence is the language of lazy men, or so I've always believed. By the time I reached the car, the first drops of rain had begun, that fine, chalky mist that makes everything seem more permanent than it is. I sat behind the wheel for a long time, watching the rain gather in little pearls along the windscreen. Find the misquoted Catullus. I told myself it meant nothing, a final literary indulgence from a man whose mind had grown weary, but even as I thought it, I didn't believe it. Not entirely. There are certain kinds of footnotes, I've found, that refuse to remain at the bottom of the page. There's a particular stillness that lives in a dead man's room. Not silence, precisely. Silence can be shattered. But stillness, like breath held too long or thought suspended mid-sentence. Norville's quarters were still. The college had done what they always do in such cases, preserved order with the delicacy of denial. Curtains tied back, surfaces dusted. No trace of disruption, only absence. I asked the porter for the key, and he handed it over without ceremony, as if I were retrieving a lost umbrella. The room was neither grand nor austere. Books, mostly. Books in piles and books in rows, and some that leaned precariously against the strain of old bindings. A clock ticked faintly from a shelf that held nothing else. I stood there longer than I needed to, waiting for something not entirely definable to rise to the surface. And then I saw her. A photograph. Not framed. Just tucked beside an annotated edition of Horace. Faded. gloss worn matte with age. A woman beneath a flowering wisteria vine, caught mid-turn, her expression unreadable. Not quite smiling, not quite looking at the camera. The sort of face one remembers, not for beauty, but for suggestion of something left unsaid. The back bore only a pencil mark. Trinity Gardens, 63. Slipped it into my coat pocket before I could think better of it. There are lines one should not cross, but I have learned that grief has no etiquette, and neither does truth. On Norville's desk, there were a few half-used notepads, a dried-out fountain pen, and a letter, unsent, written on creamy stationery, the sort one can only buy at the better shops along the High. It was in Latin, mostly. Rough Latin. Classical phrases grafted uneasily onto personal grammar. Not quite a love letter. Not quite an apology. The signature was torn off. There was something peculiar about the way the lines trailed, as if he had begun with the intention to confess, only to find language inadequate halfway through. One phrase stood out, Sataquises, philosophus mansises. If you had remained silent, you would have remained a philosopher. An odd choice for a man who had spent his life publishing footnotes. I held the page up to the light, half hoping for an imprint beneath the tear. Nothing. Back in the car, I unfolded the photograph again. There was a certain formality in the woman's stance. Not staged exactly, but curated. She was dressed in what might have been a summer dress, pale with buttons too small to see clearly. Behind her, the windows of a Georgian terrace reflected nothing. I thought of Norville, a man who had lived alone, taught forgotten poets, and died without spectacle. What kind of attachment survives decades only to be tucked into a book no one was meant to borrow? I asked Lewis to look into any records from Trinity College in the early 60s. Students, fellows, visitors. He muttered something about old files and harder rain. He didn't complain, which is always more telling than when he does. I stopped at the pub on the way home. Not for drink, though I had one. Not for the company, though there was none. I brought the crossword with me, today's, and stared at it without solving a single clue. One caught my eye, though. 8 across. Once kept in a frame, forgotten in pages. 9, asterisk. I traced the boxes absently, then let the paper fall. Somewhere, I felt the shape of something beginning to align. Not a pattern, not yet, but the suggestion of one. Like the trace of perfume long after the wearer has vanished. I drove home slowly, through streets slick with late rain, wondering not who the woman was, but why she had been left so deliberately unspoken, and whether, as in all things with Oxford men, it was pride or pain that had preserved her. St. Oswald's had the air of a place that resented being remembered. Its stones, too pale to be noble and too old to be fashionable, seemed to retreat inward. Even its gates, heavy ironwork painted in dull charcoal, opened with reluctance, as though admitting guests was a concession to necessity rather than custom. I returned on a Tuesday. The light was low and undecided, the sort that never quite resolves into afternoon. Lewis had gone to interview a former colleague of Norville's in Banbury. I preferred the solitude, or perhaps I only imagined I worked better in it. Inside the porter's lodge, a small radio murmured a Bach partita, slightly off frequency. I asked for access to the fellow's stairs. The porter didn't ask why. The colleges never do. They have long mastered the art of inquiry, without words. I took the long route, through the cloisters, past the chapel, up the stone steps that curved like a question left unanswered. The hush of colleges isn't silence exactly. It's more like the sound of expectation just before a name is spoken. Dr. Thomas Berridge answered the door before I knocked. He must have seen me from the window, or perhaps he'd anticipated the visit. He wore a jumper with holes at both cuffs and smelled faintly of gin and peppermint, a combination that suggested bad nerves and worse memories. He gestured vaguely toward a chair that looked like it had once held opinions. I remained standing. He said Norville didn't have many friends in the end. Said it with the defiance of someone who resents being left behind. There was something in the way he touched the rim of his teacup. Not quite tremor, not quite hesitation. He spoke of Norville's recent frustrations, administrative pettiness, archive access denied, some minor territorial squabble over departmental minutes. The college, it seemed, had forgotten its own past in order to better preserve its present. The kind of forgetting that happens not with age, but with intent. He paused when I mentioned the will, or rather, the possibility of one. Norville's affairs were private, he said, oddly emphatic. A note of loyalty, perhaps, or fear disguised as reverence. There was a photograph on Berridge's desk, recent, a group of fellows taken at some ceremonial dinner. Norville was seated at the edge, slightly apart, as though he hadn't meant to be in the frame at all. Next to him, a man I didn't recognize. Younger, immaculately dressed, I asked. Berridge answered too quickly. Visiting academic, only briefly attached. French, I think. No name comes to mind. I didn't press, but I noticed the photo had been cropped on the left side, just enough to exclude someone else. Not sloppily, not viciously, just enough. Outside, the bells marked the half-hour, always a half-truth, never a whole. I walked through the chapel on my way out. No service. Just the thick hush of unused sanctity. The air was heavy with the smell of beeswax and cold marble. I sat in the back pew for a moment, not in prayer, not quite in thought. Simply waiting. Something in Norville's past had been sealed, not by time but by convenience. Berridge had said nothing, but he had said it too carefully. There are silences that come from grief, and then there are silences that come from arrangement. On the bulletin board in the corridor outside, a sheet of paper fluttered slightly in the air from a cracked window, a list of scheduled readings. The last entry was struck through in red ink. Guest lecturer, Professor Hugo Eldon. I hadn't heard that name in yours. Nor had most. Eldon had vanished from Oxford long before I joined the force. A quiet scandal, if I remembered. No papers, no headlines. Just the slow erasure of someone once inconvenient. The college, it seemed, had forgotten many things, but its corridors still whispered if you knew how to listen. And somewhere between the absence in a photograph and a name struck through in red, I began to suspect that Saint. Oswald's hadn't forgotten at all. It had merely chosen not to remember. Some evenings arrive with a kind of pre-written melancholy, the light too pale for comfort, the wind just sharp enough to remind you that time continues, whether you choose to or not. It was one of those evenings when I found myself sitting in the back corner of the Eagle and Child, a pint of something I'd barely tasted beside me, and the Times crossword unfolded with deliberate futility on the table. Lewis had rung earlier. He said Norville's bank records showed nothing remarkable, only that he'd cancelled an annual standing order to the college library a few days before his death. A small act, easily missed, but in Oxford, money rarely moves without significance. My pen hovered over the crossword. Clue, 10 across. Echo of guilt in Latin flourish conceals regret. 9. I stared at it for minutes that felt like hours. My fingers traced the letters idly. The answer came slowly, the way a truth sometimes does. Penitence. It was too apt, too sharp. I circled it twice, as if to insist upon its relevance. Berridge had mentioned something about Norville growing frustrated in the weeks before he died. Not in any dramatic way, Norville wasn't a man to erupt, but in the small, corrosive fashion of someone denied a particular book or letter too many times. I wondered then what he had asked for and been refused. I returned to the college library before closing. The building seemed to creak with the effort of keeping itself intact. The librarian, a different one this time, offered a cautious smile. I asked about archive access. Norville's requests in the last month of his life. She hesitated, not out of secrecy, but sympathy. She fetched a slim register, its entries inked in neat clerical hand. There were 3 entries under Norville's name, all dated within a 10-day stretch. One struck me: request denied. Will of Marian Lake, 1963, sealed at donor request. The other 2 related to correspondences with Hugo Eldon, also sealed. A pattern was forming, or perhaps it was just the illusion of one, but sometimes the illusion is enough to keep going. Marian Lake. A name not unfamiliar, a whisper from a different decade, a former student. Died young. I couldn't recall the circumstances. Perhaps I had never known them, but her name and Eldon's together in the same sealed folders. It scratched against something old in my memory, like a splinter in polished wood. I stepped outside just as the college bell tolled 7. Dusk had settled like a second skin across the quad. I lit a cigarette I didn't want and leaned against the gatepost, watching a figure cross the square with hurried footsteps and a downcast gaze. For a moment, I thought I recognized the shape. The same visiting academic from Berridge's photograph, but he turned away before I could be sure. At home, I laid the crossword on the desk beside Norville's unfinished letter. I read both side by side, letting them speak in their own peculiar code. The Latin in the letter was fragmentary, full of borrowed endings and unmoored beginnings, but one line lingered. Dolorem si voluisti invenisti. If you sought pain, you have found it. It wasn't addressed to anyone. Perhaps that was the point. I poured myself a whiskey and drank it slowly, the warmth doing little to dispel the chill that had settled somewhere deeper. There is something profoundly Oxford about hiding confessions in footnotes and acrostics, as if to say the truth is not what we speak, but what we arrange, quietly in margins. That night I dreamed, not of Norville, but of a room I couldn't enter. A woman stood beyond the glass, her face not quite visible, her hand resting lightly on a windowsill. She did not wave. She did not move. She only watched. When I woke, the word from the crossword was still there in my mind. Penitence. And I began to wonder if Norville, in his own way, had left us a puzzle with only one possible solution. Not justice, not vengeance, but something quieter. Something that asks not to be solved, but simply understood. There are men who vanish with drama, noise, rupture, the flapping of loose pages in the wind. And there are those who disappear like ink fading from an old inscription, leaving only the impression of presence long after the meaning has gone. Hugo Eldon had been the latter. I drove out to his house just beyond Charlbury, the sort of place that appears on no map and expects no visitors. The weather was undecided, not quite grey, not quite gold, and the trees leaned toward the road as though listening to something just out of hearing. He answered himself, which surprised me. Time had hollowed him out rather than softened him. The face, once sharp, had lost its conviction. His eyes were quick, though too quick to be entirely at peace. He said he remembered me, though I doubted it. Offered tea. I declined. He gestured toward a chair as if it made no difference to him whether I sat or not. I chose to stand. I said Julian Norville's name, and he closed the door more firmly than necessary. There was no denial, only a pause. He said he hadn't seen Julian in years. I told him the visitor's register at St. Oswald suggested otherwise. He smiled, the way a man might when reminded of an overdue bill he had hoped had been forgotten. He said Norville had invited him to tea. Said he had declined. But the hesitation came between the 2 sentences, not within them. A small fault line, but I'd learned to watch for those. He asked why I was interested. I told him Julian had died. He nodded, not surprised. Said nothing of sadness. Only this. Julian was always most comfortable among ghosts. The sitting room was warm, and yet the books had dust on their spines. books not touched in years, except one, on the small side table beside Eldon's chair, Horace, Odes and Apodes. An edition I'd seen before in Norville's room. The binding was the same. I said as much. He replied that many dons had that edition. I said perhaps, but few kept them within reach of a hand too old to read for pleasure. He didn't answer, just looked at me, and for a moment the mask cracked. Not with guilt, not exactly, but with recognition, the kind you see in the mirror when you remember something you tried very hard not to. I asked if he remembered Marian Lake. He said the name too quickly. That's how I knew it still hurt. He said she had been brilliant, undisciplined, ambitious in the way women weren't allowed to be then, and that Julian had loved her, more than he should have. I asked if he had. He said very quietly that not everything broken needs to be named. There was a pause then, long enough to count by breath, and then he added, almost as an afterthought, that some tragedies come not from cruelty, but from care left untended. He looked tired, not theatrically so, just the kind of tired that grows behind the eyes. I said nothing more. I let silence do the rest. On the way out, I noticed a small square photograph, turned face down on the mantel. Dust around its edges suggested it hadn't been moved in years, but someone had turned it recently. Back in the car, I jotted a note. Not to forget the book, the photograph, the pause after Lake's name. Some men forget deliberately. Others remember too well and pretend they've forgotten. With Eldon, I wasn't yet sure which was the more dangerous. But I had begun to wonder whether Julian Norville, in trying to protect something buried in the past, had only succeeded in unearthing it, and whether, in the end, there had been more love than hatred in whatever had gone wrong. Or perhaps they were never separate things at all. The memorial service was held in the chapel at St. Oswald's. I went, though I wasn't expected, and certainly not needed. The dead don't need eulogies from men who barely knew them, only silence and sometimes a witness. The rain had stopped by then, but the air still carried its memory. Dampness clung to the stone like a secret reluctant to dry. The chapel, as always, held its chill in reserve, not cold precisely, but untouched by warmth. I sat 3 pews from the back, beside a cracked hymnal and beneath a brass plaque dedicated to a provost who had died of influenza in 1911. It felt appropriate. A choir of undergraduates, more formal than melodic, sang a Latin hymn, one I half recognized from my own school days, the sort drilled into boys with voices just beginning to break. Daizirai, Daizilla. That day of wrath. That day. But it wasn't the melody that caught my attention. It was a single word, slipped in like an ill-fitting tile in a mosaic. They sang dolorem, where the original demanded doloremque. I felt it. Not a mistake, but a choice. Subtle, but too subtle for most. But once heard, it clung. Afterwards, there were biscuits and polite sadness in the senior common room. Port was offered, declined. Condolences drifted through the room like dust motes. Phrases rehearsed, softened at the edges. I found the assistant librarian, Jennings, I think her name was, standing awkwardly near the fireplace, holding a saucer without a cup. I asked her, as gently as I could, whether Norville had spoken recently about the chapel archives. She blinked twice, as though trying to remember which secrets were permitted. Then, after a pause, he said that he'd asked about a plaque. A small memorial tucked behind the choir stalls for someone named Lake. Marian Lake. She added quietly that the date on the inscription had recently been corrected. A new brass plate was fitted only a few months prior. I asked why. She said the original had listed her birth year incorrectly. Just by 1 digit. An archivist's oversight, she supposed. Or not. I walked back alone. The quad was empty, the light fading. I slipped into the chapel again, unlit now, the air heavier. I found the plaque. Simple. Marian Lake, 1941 to 1963. A light briefly held. The birth year, 1941. But the library register had listed it as 1940. The sealed will, the correspondence, the denied access. Norville had known the date was wrong. He had asked for the archives not to correct it, but someone had. I pressed my palm to the brass. Cold, naturally, but the kind of cold that feels placed, deliberate. On my way out, I stopped beneath the stained glass. The colored figures looked older than they were, which is often the case in Oxford, where memory ages faster than the things it describes. I stood there thinking not of Julian Norville, but of the change in that hymn. One syllable dropped, one link severed. Dolorem. Instead of doloremque, grief without the binding. Lewis rang as I stepped outside. He said he'd been digging into the original records on Marian Lake. There wasn't much, but her file had been marked confidential, which was odd for a former student with no official scandal. And there was no record of a burial. Only this: her estate had been passed to the college. All of it. On condition that her personal effects remained sealed until 50 years after her death. I told him I'd meet him in the morning. Then I stood in the rain that had begun again, a finer, almost apologetic drizzle, and looked up at the chapel's tower. Julian Norville had known something had been altered, and now I knew it too. A single syllable removed, a date corrected, a photograph buried in a desk drawer. Sometimes the truth doesn't arrive like thunder. Sometimes it comes like a word skipped in a song you almost remember and leaves you wondering why it hurts. I read the name again under the chapel light, not because I doubted it, but because I needed the weight of it. Marian Lake. A name that sounded almost fabricated. Too balanced, too literary. Like something a poet might invent for a woman who'd never really existed. But she had existed. Briefly. And I had begun to suspect that the most dangerous thing about her was not her life, but her disappearance. Back in the station, I asked Lewis to find her file again, the proper one, the file that ought not to exist. He gave me that look he reserves for when he thinks I'm being willfully opaque, which, to his credit, I was. But he left without argument. He knew by then when to follow the thread and when to let it coil. I stayed in my office, pulled the photograph from my jacket pocket, the one I'd taken from Norville's room. Her face was younger than I'd first realized. Not quite a student, not quite a woman, yet sure of herself. The kind of face that doesn't fade so much as weight. The date on the back read 1963. The year she drowned, or so the record claimed. But there were things that didn't quite fit. The sealed will, the corrected birth year, the lack of any burial record. And now, a line from her unpublished poems, buried, rather absurdly, in a box of Norville's lecture notes that Lewis had unearthed from the college's long-term storage. They weren't poems in the strictest sense, not quite metered, but they had the shape of confession, the kind that doesn't ask to be heard, only preserved. One ended with the line, "The dawn who marks with ink and absence both." A strange phrase, but not meaningless. Ink, absence, both. There were markings in the chapel register too. Jennings had found them earlier that day. Norville's last visits, timed irregularly. The last was 3 weeks before his death, a Thursday. He had signed into the archives at 10 and signed out at 11. The only document accessed, a letter, from Lake to Eldon. It had not been returned. I asked Lewis to look through Norville's books again. Not the library ones, but the personal ones. The kind no one ever catalogues. The kind filled with dedications and wrong-sized bookmarks. He rang just before dusk. Said he'd found something. It was in a hollowed-out copy of The Golden Bough. A cliché, but a literary one, and that suited Norville. Inside, a single sheet of paper. Folded, not yellowed. The ink has not faded. A letter, unsigned. She wrote, You told me once that forgetting was kinder than regret. But the forgetting was yours, not mine. I was never gone. You just stopped saying my name. Asterisk. I read it twice, then again. It was dated 1984, not 1963. She had written it 21 years after her supposed death. I sat very still, then poured myself something I hadn't earned. So she hadn't drowned. Or she had, but not in water. She had disappeared, yes, but not because the world erased her. Someone had chosen her silence, and the college had agreed. Norville had kept the letter, not copied it, not shared it, only kept it, and visited her plaque as though paying penance to a version of a woman the rest of Oxford had agreed never existed. What kind of place forgets a living woman and remembers her only once she's gone? A college chapel, a sealed archive, a corrected brass plate. I walked that evening to the river, not from instinct but from need. The Isis was still. Too still, the kind of stillness that pretends at peace but holds something beneath. I thought about Eldon, about Norville, about the woman who wasn't, and I found myself thinking not of drowning but of exile, the quieter kind, the kind that begins when people start using the past tense before they're ready to be left behind. The morning had been heavy with that low, grey kind of light that makes every building in Oxford seem older than it is, and every decision made inside them older still. I found myself back in the library, not for any particular reason that would make sense in a report, but because something in the air had begun to bother me, like the silence after an echo that never quite returned. The misquote. I had read it over too many times. Norville's scrawl. Find the misquoted Catullus. At first, I thought it was misdirection, an academic flourish, but the more I turned it over, the less clever it seemed. Not cryptic, but wounded. There are hundreds of Catullus quotes a scholar could manipulate. But this wasn't a random theft. It was a reference with intent. I went back to the poem I thought it echoed. Poem 101. The funeral elegy, a brother's ashes, carried across the seas. Multas per gentes et multa per aquora vectus. The line everyone remembers. But Norville had swapped grief for longing, and longing for something far quieter. He had written his own translation, not Latin to English, but passed to regret. Downstairs, the college archivist, a tall, pale man who looked like he had been exhaled by the building itself, handed me a slip of paper without speaking. It was an access record, 3 decades old. Norville, again. The document he'd requested was not by Catullus. It was a letter, from Eldon, to Lake, dated after her supposed death. Lewis joined me by midday. He brought coffee I didn't want and news I already knew. The woman had lived. For a time, quietly, somewhere in the north. The records were incomplete. A tenancy in a village near Haworth. A cancelled telephone account, a blurred photograph from a parish council event. The face turned slightly away. Lewis said she had gone by a different name. Not Lake, but the same initials. MLA poet still. Privately published. Reviews that used words like elliptical and bracingly unresolved. She had vanished again in the 1990s. No death certificate, just absence. He looked at me, as though waiting for something. Permission, perhaps, or disbelief. I gave him neither. Instead, I asked him if he'd noticed the stained glass in the college chapel, the one above the organ loft. He said no. I said the inscription was misquoted. Another misquote. But not Norville's this time. The glass had been installed in 1965, according to the chapel log. A donation from an anonymous source. The quote, atque in perpetuum soror habeatque vale. But Catullus never wrote soror. He wrote frater, brother. The dedication had changed a sibling into a sister, quietly, without note. No one had corrected it. Perhaps no one had noticed. Norville had, and he had begun to chase ghosts across syntax. I returned alone that afternoon, the chapel empty. The light struck the glass just wrong enough to reveal the flaw. The lead was newer there. Restored, perhaps, or replaced. Someone had tried to erase the truth by making it too elegant. I sat in the pew below and read through the poems again. Marian's last collection. Unpublished, of course. A gift from someone anonymous to the Bodleian's locked shelves. One line stopped me. I was never the footnote. I was the margin. I was where the truth ran when the line broke. The kind of thing students scribble and professors dismiss. But Norville hadn't. He had followed her. In grammar, in hymnals, in stained glass. He had marked her absence like a scholar unable to forget a text he once misread. And somewhere along the way, he had begun to believe that guilt could be rewritten, that a lifetime of silence might be redeemed by a careful edit. But a misquote is not the same as a correction, and a plaque is not a resurrection. I sat there longer than I should have, reading and rereading a poem that may never have been meant for anyone. Outside, the quad darkened. Rain gathered in the gutters. A student passed by humming a melody I almost recognized, and I began to wonder if Julian Norville had ever meant for any of it to be discovered, or if he'd simply been speaking one final time in the only language he trusted. Footnotes, misquotes, and grief shaped into grammar. There are endings that arrive loudly, with sirens and flashbulbs and doors forced open. And then there are endings that come like a book closing in an empty room. No hand visible, no noise, just the finality of the thing felt in the echo. Julian Norville's undoing was of the latter kind. I returned to see Eldon one last time, not because I expected revelation or even honesty, but because there was something left between us. Not unspoken, but unfinished. His home hadn't changed. The paint flaked like tired memories, and the brass knocker bore the same hairline crack I'd noticed before. He opened the door as if expecting me. Perhaps he was. He didn't ask why I'd come. I told him anyway. I told him I had read the letter Marian had written in 1984, that I had seen the stained glass window, the misquoted Latin, the donation record unsigned, that I knew Julian had requested the will, had tried, perhaps foolishly, to set something right without speaking it aloud. Eldon stood for a while, facing the window. The air in the room was close, like the pause before a string breaks. He said only this: that woman was a genius, and they destroyed her for being inconvenient. It wasn't a confession. Not quite. But it was more than denial. I said nothing. He turned, poured himself a whiskey, asked if I wanted one. I shook my head. The room already smelled of oak and surrender. He said the college had decided long ago she was to be forgotten, not punished, not scandalized, just removed. Quietly, efficiently. An absence curated as delicately as any archive. He said Julian had tried, in his own way, to remember her, but he hadn't the courage to do it in daylight. He paused, then added, "None of us did." I asked why he hadn't stopped it, whatever it was. He looked at me for a long time, the kind of gaze that tries to rewrite its own past just by holding it still. He said she had asked him not to, that she had chosen to vanish, that Oxford would not change, only the names on the doors would, and that silence, properly arranged, could be its own kind of defiance. I left without finishing my tea. Outside, the wind had picked up, not wildly, just enough to suggest that something had shifted, not ended, merely moved on. At the station, Lewis sat at his desk with a file he didn't want to open. Said the coroner's report had come back. Norville had died of natural causes, but the levels of his medication were inconsistent. Nothing to shout about. But not nothing. Lewis asked if we were treating it as suicide. I said no. I said we weren't treating it as anything. He looked puzzled, then let it go. He's learned over the years the value of unanswered questions. That night I returned to the crossword. Guardian, this time. A clue. Where the forgotten keep living. 8. Asterisk. I stared at it longer than I meant to. The answer was too obvious. Memory. But I didn't write it in. Instead, I poured myself a drink and opened Marian's final poem again. The last line read, "They'll say I died in 63. Let them. The truth is lonelier." The next morning, Strange called. Said the matter was best left closed. No statements, no inquiry. Nothing to alarm the college or the press. He said it with the practiced indifference of a man who believed closure was the same as silence. I agreed. Perhaps for the last time. I walked later that afternoon along the path behind the river, where the trees bent just slightly toward the water, as though listening for names never spoken, aloud. I carried nothing with me but a slip of paper from Norville's desk. One line, in his handwriting, underlined twice. "Forgive what cannot be repaid, only reread." The wind lifted it from my hand before I reached the bridge. I didn't chase it. Some stories are not meant to be solved, only remembered and misremembered, both at once. It ends, I suppose, the way it always does. Not with thunder, not with certainty, but with a silence that insists upon itself. A room left exactly as it was. A page folded down not to return to, but simply to say, here. Here is where we stopped reading. Norville's death had left no debris, only residue. And in the weeks since, the story had receded from Oxford's memory as water does from old stone. Not all at once, but slowly, imperceptibly, until only the suggestion of damp remained. They said in the end that he died peacefully. A man of years, a man of letters, that he left no heirs, no complications, that he was, as one senior fellow phrased it with chilling efficiency, tidy in his exit. But I knew better. I'd seen the letters, the photographs. The misquotes are embedded like bruises into stained glass and hymnals and footnotes no one else had bothered to read. He hadn't been tidy. He'd been terrified and brave. In that quiet, hopeless way certain men have. Those who've made a life out of watching others choose more dangerous forms of living. I sat that evening in my flat, the windows open to a half-rain, half-light that didn't seem to know whether it meant to stay or go. I placed the final piece of Norville's puzzle beside the crossword. One line from his journal, underlined twice. Some truths are easier to code than confess. And next to it, the last crossword he'd ever begun. Half finished, 10 down. A life left between lines. 7 letters. The answer was obvious once you stopped trying to be clever. Margin. He had lived in the margins, not just academically, but emotionally, always one step from the line, never crossing it. He had loved once, or twice, or maybe just once, very deeply, and never again. He had carried a name, hers, like a borrowed word from a poem whose meter he could not match, but which still refused to be forgotten. I returned, one final time, to the chapel. It was late, after hours. The porter had nodded me through with a glance that understood things without needing to approve them. The rain had stopped, and in its place, a hush that felt newly earned. The chapel was dark, save for the amber of the sanctuary lamp and the glint of the brass plaque that bore her name. Marian Lake, 1941 to 1963. A light briefly held. A lie, but a beautiful one. I traced the letters with the back of my hand. Not as an officer, just as a man who had come too close to something and did not wish to leave empty-handed. Above, the stained glass caught a flicker of moonlight. Avatque vale, it said, the wrong Latin. Or perhaps the only right one, depending on which kind of grief you subscribed to. I sat in the back pew and I listened. Not for a voice. Not even for an answer. Just for that moment when silence begins to make sense. When the absence becomes part of the structure. When the gap in the narrative is the most important part of the story. Lewis would ask in the morning if there was anything to report. I would say no. He would nod. He had learned that some endings weren't to be written down. Not out of duty, but decency. Strange would approve, perhaps without knowing why. The college would remain untouched. The archive would sleep again. And in some quiet village, perhaps in Yorkshire, perhaps not even there anymore, a woman once called Marian Lake, or no longer, would not know that a man had died with her name tucked into a book he never returned. I left nothing behind but breath on the chapel's glass. At home, I poured a final whiskey and wrote a single word in my own crossword, though it didn't fit the clue. Forgiveness. Whether his or mine or hers, I couldn't say. Some stories ask not to be solved, only to be read again, more carefully this time, and then set down, quietly, as one does with a life.